Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are undertaking really a critical mission, decoding the profound and often missed reality of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, specifically in women. And for you, the listener, if you've spent your life feeling maybe fundamentally overwhelmed or exhausted by things that seem easy for others, maybe harboring deep shame, well, this dive is really designed to be your light bulb moment. We need to expose the diagnostic gaps, dismantle that shame, and, finally provide the instruction manual you've always deserved.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here, I think, is understanding the historical context and just the sheer scale of the problem. We are truly talking about what some call a lost generation of women. Individuals who grew up without a diagnosis simply because the medical world's understanding of ADHD was built on a model that was so narrow, so rigid, it just failed entirely to see the female experience.
Okay, so let's unpack that failure then. The foundational research, it was built on one very specific blueprint, right? This idea of the highly visible, physically disruptive, maybe aggressive boy who just can't sit still, interrupts constantly. That stereotype, we can call it the hyperactive boy blueprint. That's what clinicians were trained to spot.
Precisely. And that very training created the massive gap we're talking about. Because while boys often show these externalizing behaviors, the ones that are pretty hard to ignore the female experience is often dominated by internalizing symptoms. The most common presentation in women, the one historically just missed, is the predominantly inattentive type.
And when we say inattentive, we're not talking about a total lack of attention, which I think is a common misconception. It's more a difficulty in regulating attention. So what does that difficulty, that regulation problem, actually look like day to day?
Well, it's subtle, and that's exactly why it was missed for so long. It looks like chronic problems with organization, making those sort of careless mistakes because you maybe failed to give close attention to details, struggling desperately to sustain attention, especially on tasks that aren't super engaging, and crucially, maybe appearing not to listen when someone's talking directly to you. These are the symptoms that were just actively excluded by that original male-centric definition.
Okay. So if the hyperactive part isn't always visible, like the boy bouncing off the walls, where does all that extra energy go? It doesn't just disappear, I imagine.
It absolutely doesn't vanish. It goes internal.
Okay.
We talk about this concept of internalized hyperactivity. So the body might look still, maybe even focused, but internally the thoughts are just, well, the phrase often used is going a million miles a minute. It's this relentless, constant internal restlessness, a kind of brain buzz.
That makes perfect sense. So, okay, that excessive talking or chattiness that sometimes gets written off as just, oh, she's just very social. That could actually be a release valve for that internal overload.
Exactly. Or, contrast that with the classic stereotype of the daydreaming girl that teachers might have just sort of waved off. That girl isn't just lazily daydreaming. She's often kind of immobilized, actually fatigued by that overwhelming internal brain buzz. That internal chaos is just as debilitating, maybe even more so sometimes, than the physical hyperactivity we see in boys. It's a huge source of chronic mental exhaustion for women with ADHD.
Okay, so if the core attention issues are so subtle and often overlooked, then the consequences of that lifelong struggle, they must become the thing that eventually gets noticed or diagnosed. Is that the misdiagnosis pipeline you mentioned?
That is the core tragedy, really. She struggles, right? She internalizes that struggle. She ends up drawing conclusions about herself. I must be dumb, or I'm just not good enough, I'm lazy. And this directly creates genuine anxiety or depression, and this really profound low self-esteem.
So when she finally does seek help, maybe years later, she presents with those powerful emotional symptoms because they're the most painful, the most visible part of her experience at that point.
Right. She walks in saying, I have crippling anxiety, or I think I'm depressed. And the clinician, quite rightly, treats the anxiety and the depression because they are very real comorbid conditions.
Yeah.
But by treating only the consequence, they completely miss the underlying ADHD that is driving all of that emotional distress in the first place. And for so many women, this leaves the root cause totally unaddressed. It leads to years, sometimes decades, of this sort of revolving door, ineffective treatment.
Wow. So if the struggle is this deep, how are these women functioning? Often, seemingly well into adulthood before anything comes to light. They must have developed some serious, really complex coping mechanisms just to survive day to day.
Oh, absolutely. They have to. And this leads us directly into the concept of masking, or sometimes called camouflaging. It's this kind of chameleon-like survival strategy, and it's often driven by powerful social expectations and this intense, often lifelong fear of rejection. To keep up this appearance of normalcy, women with ADHD often end up having to, as one source put it, work 2 to 3 times as hard as her peers just to be equally successful.
Which creates this mask of competence. She looks calm, professional, maybe even like a super high achiever on the surface.
Exactly. But underneath that surface, she is paddling furiously, desperately, just to stay afloat. And that relentless internal effort, that constant monitoring and compensating, that's the source of the chronic mental fatigue. And often one of the main tools in that mask, ironically, is something we tend to praise: perfectionism.
Wait, hang on. You're saying perfectionism here isn't necessarily a positive trait. It's actually a defense mechanism.
In this context, yes. Very often, it is entirely a desperate, fear-based coping mechanism. It's designed to overcompensate for that internal chaos, the disorganization, the executive function struggles we'll get into. Think about that example from the source material. A girl stays up until 1 a.m. making a project absolutely perfect. She likely didn't do it out of some inherent virtue of perfectionism. She probably did it because she procrastinated for days, maybe paralyzed by the task, and the perfectionism becomes the shield. It hides the shame of the last-minute panic and the internal chaos that actually drove the procrastination.
That system, that intense effort of masking and perfectionism, it sounds exhausting. It eventually has to break down, doesn't it? How does that usually happen? What triggers what the sources call the blowout?
Yeah, the blowout often happens during a major life transition. Something that simply adds new, maybe more complex executive function demands that the existing masking system just can't handle anymore. The coping strategies get overwhelmed. The classic triggers are pretty predictable. The transition to college, maybe, with its lack of structure, starting a really demanding career, or a huge one is the absolute explosion of executive demands that comes with pregnancy, childbirth, and then the layering in of additional children, as one source put it.
And suddenly the woman feels this growing gap, this disparity between what's being required of her and what she feels capable of actually doing.
Exactly. It's the moment the mask just becomes too heavy to hold up. And
Yeah.
it's important to understand the blowout isn't really a new problem emerging. It's the revelation of the lifelong underlying condition that was always there, just managed until it couldn't be anymore. And this often leads to these profound feelings of being perpetually nervous, scared, overwhelmed, and just kind of wilting under the constant stress.
Okay, so let's try and translate this constant, often invisible struggle into the internal world of emotion. If we really want to understand what it feels like, we have to talk about something called Rejection Sensitive Dysphoria, or RSD. What is that?
RSD is, well, it's considered one of the most painful aspects of the ADHD experience for many. It's an intense emotional reaction described sometimes as severe emotional pain that gets triggered by rejection, criticism, or failure, whether it's perceived or actual. It can manifest as these pervasive, chronic feelings of just not being good enough or having extreme emotional reactions to even mild or constructive criticism. And it can even lead to avoiding opportunities altogether because the fear of potential rejection or failure is just so profound.
And this must be particularly brutal for women, right? Because of social conditioning about being accommodating and pleasing others.
It creates an absolutely impossible bind. You've got the ADHD brain, which seems neurologically wired for heightened emotional sensitivity anyway, magnifying these feelings. Then you combine that with social conditioning that, as you say, heavily supports the idea of female obligation to accommodate others' needs. The result is almost guaranteed anxiety and shame because the woman constantly feels like she is continually disappointing others, even when she's giving absolutely everything she has, often burning herself out in the process.
And beyond just the sensitivity to rejection, there's a more general emotional volatility sometimes, isn't there? What our sources called emotional dysregulation.
Yes, and again, it's crucial to frame this correctly. This isn't a character flaw or a moral failing. It's understood as a neurological issue. The brain essentially has difficulty modulating the intensity and the duration of emotional responses. Things feel bigger, last longer. This is where you might see irritability or what feels like a short fuse, or just experiencing emotions, much more intensely big emotions.
I think it's important for people listening, maybe partners or family members too, to remember the context here. That sudden angry outburst at home, it often isn't really an overreaction to, say, spilled milk.
No, exactly. It's often the cumulative effect. It's the uncontrolled neurological release of a full day's worth, maybe a week's worth of suppressed frustration, the cognitive exhaustion from all that masking, and the internal pain just building up. The lid finally just blows off.
Okay. Ultimately, the core kind of mechanical explanation for so many of these struggles, whether it's the inability to just start a task or that overwhelming feeling of clutter, comes back to executive dysfunction or EF.
Yes. Fundamentally, ADHD is understood as a disorder of executive function. These are the skills managed by the prefrontal cortex, the CEO of the brain, if you like. Skills responsible for planning, prioritizing, organizing tasks, initiating action, managing time, regulating emotions, all of that. And the non-judgmental truth, the thing listeners really need to internalize is this. Struggles with what look like simple adult tasks are not moral failings. They're not laziness. They reflect a cognitive skill deficit.
I really like the translation table idea in the source material because it makes this clinical concept, EF deficits, so much more real. Let's look at a few examples of what that looks like maybe in the home environment.
Okay, sure. Take task initiation. The EF deficit there often manifests as what's called task paralysis. That feeling of just staring at a sink full of dishes, knowing you need to do them, wanting to do them, but being physically unable to make your body start. It can feel genuinely painful. Or consider organization. That deficit often leads to the infamous doom piles, piles of stuff that don't have a home, or the classic laundry mountain. Why is laundry so incredibly hard for so many people with ADHD? Because washing, drying, folding, sorting, putting away, it's a multi-step cognitive nightmare. There are just too many sequential steps for struggling executive function system to easily manage all at once.
And of course, the big one, time management.
Which, for many with ADHD, is better described as time blindness. It's this profound difficulty in accurately perceiving or estimating the passage of time or how long tasks will take. This inevitably results in chronically underestimating how long things will take and consequently often being late no matter how hard you try or how much you care about being on time.
And this EF failure, especially around household tasks and organization, loops right back to that gendered shame we talked about earlier, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Because traditional social expectations often still dictate that managing the home is primarily the woman's responsibility. A failure in that area, struggling with chores, clutter, organization, isn't just perceived as a failure of chores. It's often deeply internalized by the woman herself and maybe by those around her as a profound failure as a wife, as a partner, as a mother. That just layers massive, crushing shame onto what is, at its root, a neurological difficulty.
But the great news in all of this is that the diagnosis, when it finally comes, it's not a life sentence. Like you said earlier, it's the instruction manual you've been missing all along. So let's pivot to the toolkit. What helps? Starting with professional help, like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
Yes, CBT is often really essential. And one expert put it perfectly. CBT picks up where medication leaves off. Medication can help regulate the brain's signaling and chemistry, but it can't magically undo a lifetime of negative self-talk, those ingrained thought patterns and that deep-seated shame. CBT specifically helps you identify, challenge, and rebuild those things. It helps you reconstruct your self-concept, undoing that narrative that says, I am lazy, or I am stupid, or I am broken.
Okay, and for supporting that internal chemistry, those brain signals, what are the main medication options our sources mentioned?
Broadly, there are two main classes. First, the stimulants, like methylphenidate, Ritalin, or amphetamines, Adderall. They're often the first choice because they work by stimulating activity in the prefrontal cortex and tend to work quite quickly, sometimes within an hour or so. Then you have the non-stimulants like atomoxetine, Strattera. These take longer, several weeks maybe, to reach their full effect, but they aren't controlled substances, and their effects can last 24 hours, which is helpful for some people. And it's also worth noting, because anxiety and depression are so common alongside ADHD in women, it's not unusual for patients to also be prescribed certain antidepressants like bupropion, Wellbutrin, which also happen to target some relevant neurotransmitters.
Right, so once that internal chemistry is better supported, how do we start building a life and environment that actually works with this type of brain instead of against it?
The big unifying theme across almost all successful coping strategies is externalization. Essentially, you have to stop relying solely on that internal CEO, your executive functions, which has proven to be unreliable for certain tasks. Instead, you build a robust, visible, external support system for your brain. Practically, this means things like using alarms and timers constantly, not just for waking up, but for transitions between tasks. Building highly visual checklists for those multi-step routines, like the laundry example. Labeling container, drawers, everything. The goal is to offload the cognitive burden of remembering and sequencing from your internal working memory onto the external environment. Stop using precious brain energy to remember minutia.
That idea of externalizing makes so much sense. We found two specific strategies highlighted in the sources as being particularly effective. Let's start with time blocking.
Ah, yes, time blocking. This can be a really powerful antidote to that time blindness we discussed. Instead of having just an abstract to-do list, which can feel overwhelming and vague, you assign every task, and this is key, even breaks, even travel time, even buffer time, a specific block in a visual calendar, like Google Calendar or a paper planner. This transforms time from this slippery, elusive concept into something concrete, finite, and visual. It allows you to actually see your day and manage it much more effectively.
And the second one is fascinating because it sounds almost too simple, the body double.
It does sound simple, but it is incredibly effective for many people with ADHD. It's basically the strategy of working on a task, often a boring or difficult one you'd otherwise avoid, while another person is simply present in the same space, physically or even virtually, like on a video call. That other person doesn't even need to be helping you. They could be doing their own work or just reading quietly. For some reason, for the easily distractible ADHD brain, that simple, passive presence of another human provides a kind of gentle external anchor. It helps with focus, initiation, and accountability. It just makes the task feel less daunting and more manageable.
Okay, so to bring our journey today toward a close, the exhaustion, the frustration, the shame if you felt these things, it was all real. And now, hopefully, you see there's a name for it and there are solutions. This is really the beginning of unlearning potentially decades of self-blame. And remember what the sources stressed. Perfectionism and ADHD just don't mix well. You have to allow yourself some radical self-compassion.
Absolutely. And maybe the final thought to leave listeners with is this. The ultimate goal here isn't really about fixing a supposedly broken brain or forcing yourself to fit into a neurotypical mold that was never designed for you. It's more about what some experts call adopting a radical guide mindset. That means radically accepting how your unique brain actually works, understanding its strengths and its challenges, and then dedicating yourself to building a life, finding strategies, and creating an environment that genuinely supports your specific neurology, rather than one that perpetually punishes you for things you cannot easily control. That acceptance, that shift in perspective, that's truly the first and maybe the most powerful step toward freedom.